Since we're a small group, I might ask some of you if you want to come forward so I can show you stuff. I can actually show you some things before we start, which I can't do in a big group, but it's nice to be able to see and feel what you're going to be hearing. People are always asking the question, you know, what's the difference between tile and terracotta? And so it's nice to be able to try to focus on that specifically. And there'll be a lot of differences. But what I want to start with is I'm putting out 3 pieces of terracotta for you guys over here. And you guys are putting out yeah, I know what we're talking about. So this is handmade, dust press. And I will explain what those things are. Are you sure? Okay. Okay, so this is a light clay body, buff colored, and this is red. And they're both terracotta because terracotta means fire, burn earth. So it's really about the idea of the material. It's not about color per se. This is an old glaze, and this is a new one, but they're both attempting to copy brand or stone. So terracotta is a great mineral. So that's
So everything should be fine. It's just this master switch here for pendants. It's the only one that's just leaving that on. Yeah, all the other lights will be the same. Screen will be the same. So thank you. And if it, just for your reference, in any of the spaces here. So the events office extension is listed there. So 2111. So just in case you wind up needing anything. Perfect. Thank you. No problem.
There's a real difference in the feel. Red clay is like red or yellow, soft and pliable. Dust pressed clay is like flour. Completely looks like flour. You wouldn't know that it's clay. So the difference between the two has an impact on how they look and how they're made. Maybe sometimes what they're used for. This gives you a little background. You know, it would be great if I could get water. That would be just great. So what I wanted to do is I'm going to shut the lights out. It'll be semi-dark, but not super dark. And then I'm happy to answer questions as we go along, because it's great when you can really focus on teaching something, and it's a small enough group, so we really can benefit from that.
Are we good to go?
Yeah. So I just want to get a cup of water if I can. I'm actually going to pull out my script. So I chance to bury it somewhere. I leave things everywhere. Let's see. I must have left it in the other room. Let me just look. I'll look later. It's not important. Sorry. Okay. I guess I will just start. I think I know almost everybody here, but not everybody. I'm Susan Tunick. I'm president of the Friends of Terracotta, and we've been actively advocating to preserve architectural ceramics everywhere, anywhere and everywhere. And we do discriminate on the quality of the material, but we're very interested in that concern. And you'll see why in some cases the terracotta is completely overlooked, but we'll get to that in a minute. So we're just looking at 2 examples of buildings. This doesn't show. Yeah, it's over here. This is Park Chester, as you can see. This is a more three-dimensional, terracotta structure, and a very flat, very amazing, recently landmarked in East New York, the Empire State Dairy. So one is really tile, and one is really terracotta. And I'm putting them up, and I'll show you a few more, and then we'll talk about the differences. Oh, you know what? I didn't ask. Okay, so one of the great buildings in the world is the Mialika House in Vienna. It happens that the tile is made by a really important tile and terracotta company in Budapest, or near Budapest, called Journée. And it's very flat. You will see some areas that are not, up near the cornice, here, and under the windows. But in general, it's a very flat surface. In a juxtaposition is a wonderful landmark in Lower Manhattan, the Beaver Building, and you can certainly see, if you look at this head, how three-dimensional, or you look at this wreath, how three-dimensional that is. So it's just a comparison for the two materials. Okay, clay is an essential ingredient for tile and terracotta. Fired clay. It's like saying flour is needed in making bread. Whether it's the kind of flour, the kind of bread that you're going to come out with, the other ingredients, all of that is open to question. But what's very important is to understand that an underlying element is that they're both using clay. They're both materials that are easy to clean, and particularly tile was used in hospitals and used for children's wards to enliven the spaces all the time. And there's a lovely book called Brightening the Days. It's only on children's murals in London hospitals. Very typical. And at the far side, you can see the process of cleaning occurring right in here. This is dirty. This is clean. And the idea that you can simply wash your building like a plate it's not quite that easy, as many of us know. But it is important to realize, thanks, that cleaning can be fairly simple, and certainly for tile, you can keep it very, very clean if you're dealing with an interior. So then another notion that's very important is that clay that's fired is very fire resistant. What you're looking at here are 4 samples of stone, each one marked, and 4 samples of terracotta that were related in color to the stone. Everything was in a fire, and then cold water was poured on everything. And the terracotta remains intact. It's very different than what happens to the stone. It disintegrates and crumbles. And this was first recognized in the Chicago fire of 1871, which helped the terracotta industry a lot at that point. The rebuilding of Chicago, the emphasis on fire resistance was very strong. Okay, giant difference. Terracotta is usually mechanically attached, has to be, whereas tile is almost always, they use a mastic or a glue. And you can certainly see here the stainless steel anchors that are put into, this is at City Center. Today we would use stainless steel anchors. We didn't use and have stainless steel, and that's probably the biggest problem in most buildings, period. Water is the problem. It rusts the steel, which is not stainless. When steel rusts, it increases in size a giant number of times. It's powerful enough to break a brick in half, that amount of pressure. So being aware of that is very helpful in your general understanding of buildings and preservation. So you can see the installation and how really sizable these pieces are. This is at the Channon Building, and it's just great to see the back and then to see the front and have an idea about the scale of these pieces, especially when we're comparing it to tile. And this is a building, it's in Paris, and I've been watching it because it only had these tiles missing, and now it has all these and these, and it's just a sad situation. But what it allows us to see is the shallowness of the tile. So it's a very thin layer, and it's attached mastically. Now, when I mentioned dust pressing to you for tile, I mentioned it, and I said that the clay actually looks like flour. It looks like a white substance. And what you do is you take it, you put it into, if I can show you. So, yeah, I know, I hate to use it. This is a receptacle that's a tile shape, let's say 6 by 6. The flour is put in, it's smoothed off, and then the press, which could be done by hand if you turn the screw, or a mechanical press, presses down on the clay. Now there's usually a plate on the bottom, so there's going to be a design. And there's usually a plate on the other end, which is the back of the tile. It might say Robertson, like that tile does. It's the identification in the back. So once it's pressed, it is so strong that I was given one that was pressed that was totally unfired. So you're walking around, and usually unfired clay is very fragile, at the most fragile state. So I had it for a whole trip in Europe, and only when I came home on the plane did it break into a couple of pieces. But basically, it was very, very strong. That isn't to say that you wouldn't fire it. You, of course, would fire it. But what it tells you is that there's very little water. It looks like dry powder. The pressure is squeezing it together, and it's not going to shrink very much. So you're not going to have warping, and you're not going to have the size change in the tile. So those are valuable attributes for the tile. Dust press tile looks different than handmade tile. And the companies that make them are often different companies. So that's worth being aware of. You can see this more up close when you have a chance to look here at the clearing away of that powdery dust, and then the pressing of the with the hydraulic press. This technique was developed, weirdly enough, in 1861 for making buttons. Somebody decided to make clay buttons, and Minton, who was making tile at the time, realized that it was an incredible idea, and he bought into the patent and then was able to use it. And it sort of went from making, let's say, 20 tiles a day to 60 an hour. I mean, gigantic change, and sort of connects to the Industrial Revolution. This is a fireplace at a friend's home, and 2 of these tiles are shown in detail. They're from the Brooklyn International Tiling Company, and the entire house is an arts and crafts house made slowly by one minister in year after year. He lived all winter in Massachusetts, and then he'd bring the things, furniture and so on, that he made to Watermill, which is where the house is. It's incredible. But this is a nice example of dust pressed tile. The green you're looking at is one glaze. Be aware that when a glaze is on a white clay, which this is, that when it pools, it changes color. It gets nice and thick, dark green and light green. So it's only one glaze. But with the texture on the tile, you can get a nice variation. Here are 3 more examples of dust-pressed tiles. None of these are American. They're all Belgian, German, and Dutch. Here we're looking at hand-pressed tile. This is a really wonderful fireplace in a building in Madison, Wisconsin, a fraternity house. Luckily, this was one of the only things that was okay. Yeah, it was tricky. Got in there and convinced them that it was a beautiful fireplace. I have brought a Groobie Tile with me, a blue one. It's made by rolling out and pressing into a mold. And you could see that sort of in these diagrams. So that's an entirely different way of creating something. You have once you've got a dry thing that's glazed, then it's similar, you're firing. But otherwise, the whole process is really different. And that's good to know, and it helps you identify by looking at the piece. And we can look at them more after if you want. These are lovely little fireplace, or actually they're radiator grills, and they're cutouts. So these are in a number of buildings in Manhattan. You see them, and they're just such a nice decorative touch in a lobby that could be extremely mundane. Here's one of our losses, thanks to the East Side rezoning. This wonderful building, and it was the office of the of the American Encaustic Tiling Company. That was the tile you just saw, the radiator grills were made by them. This building was destroyed in several sections, so we watched one owner on a Saturday smash part of the building as we stood there going, it's being considered for landmarking. He's going, no, it isn't. And then the commission didn't consider landmarking it, and in recent years, a year ago, the rest of the tile was all taken off so as to not be eligible for landmark designation. This is the company that made, oh, it did it all by itself. Look at this, my goodness. Uh-oh, how come this is on automatic pilot? There's a robot, maybe. No, I want to go back. Maybe it's just decided to stop. Okay, maybe. Anyway, you got a preview. So the tiles for the Empire Dairy, which is the very first image I showed you with the cow, all of those were made by the American Encaustic Tiling Company. This was one of their offices in Manhattan, but they were based in Ohio, where there were great clay deposits. So it was a very, very major company, and to lose their office in New York is really sad. Another approach to looking at clay, which is also plastic, and you can feel it in this, is what are called Brocade mosaic tiles. They were made by the Moravian Tile Company, and they were pieces that were inset into large murals with concrete, sometimes into planters, and there's a beautiful planter on 18th Street on the east side that has these tiles in them. So the look, and this does look more sensual or three-dimensional plastic than the flat tiles, and I think you can see that easily. Now, these are beautiful tiles that we got to see when HDC did a tour of the Thomas Lamb United, well, I'm not sure what they call it now, but it had been the Loewy's Theater. And it was very nice to be able to identify the actual tiles. So the ones you're seeing on the wall are the same as ones from the detail, different coloring, but from the Mueller Mosaic Tile Company. It's very nice, both in tile and terracotta, to realize that with the same design, the glazing can create a very different feeling. So in a sense, the yellows come out very strongly here as sort of funny little shapes. Whereas when you look over here, there's so much yellow in the second single tile that probably the green is more alive. So it's just simply an opportunity. A tile is an opportunity to decide how you want to see the color, and usually they are not individual. And this was an amazing thing. Paul and I were once got to Istanbul. And when you see the tiling there, you see rooms, and everything becomes pattern. Instead of looking at, this one tile, and it's really, really valuable to have the context for architectural ceramics or for any number of things. But having the sense of how something is used is really wonderful because it helps you think about how you might want to plan it. Yeah.
The glazing, they press the biscuit first, right? And they get the shape. And do they fire it and then glaze it and fire it again? Or do they,
Yeah.
the glazing, that's a whole skill of itself.
Yes.
To put that,
Yes.
'cause I see they have yellow, red, and green.
Well, the red, actually there is red glaze. On this one, the red coming through, I think it's just the clay body, but I'm not sure. The process is usually that tile may well be fired 2 times, and terracotta is usually not. If it's got gold on it or some very elaborate coloring, it might have more firings. But the cost, everybody's thinking about the dollar. So the cost is crucial. Now, tiles are often, usually once fired. I mean, even in Italy, they have a lineup. I can't say these are beautiful tiles necessarily, but a lineup where in 7 minutes they can go from a dust pressed tile that's basically dry all the way through spraying and firing. I mean, into it.
Spray the metal with the glaze on?
Very often, commercially, you would do that because it has.
Masks or something to.
Oh, not for this. I'm just thinking of a solid. But for some patterns, there would be, we would call it a stencil.
Yes.
And you would put it on, and then you could spray, and then you could put another one on and spray. That just depends on,
And what is the glaze made of?
Okay, glazes have to be glass, first and foremost, because they have to melt. They have to have melters, because glass melts at a very high temperature. So you have glass, you have a melter, which we would call a flux, and then you have various chemicals that'll either make the glaze more opaque, more transparent, matte, glossy, and then you have colorants. So there's a whole range. It's a recipe, and you usually work out.
It's applied in a liquid form?
Yes.
So it's really hot when they're painting these?
No. No. They're glazed dry, and they may be glazed having been once fired. In other words, if you fire something in a bisque fire first, and then you glaze it, which would be tile generally, certain tiles, then it's not hot. It's cooled off and it's being glazed.
The glaze itself, is it powder in it or?
Glaze looks like evaporated milk, and then you add water and mix it, and then it looks like pancake dough, liquid or something.
And do all the colors go on and then separately, then you glaze it once, or is it a time fire, or are there 7 firings for the different colors?
Why I mentioned the gold is because certain temperatures are appropriate for certain glazes. So gold and maybe a red would fire at a lower temperature, which would mean you would need to do everything first, fire, and then go back, add what your touches of lower temperature, and fire again. If you fired something high, you don't have to worry about firing it low. This is like the Obamas. If they go low, we'll go high. This is not this. So because if you fire something high, it's not going to change if you fire it lower. And I can't think of a good example food-wise. I burn everything, so I don't want to go there. So, not a good thing to do. Okay, tiles can be used for all kinds of things like signage, and that certainly comes through in different things. Like this is a project that I did for the New Jersey Light Rail. These were wayfinders on light posts, and so that was useful for the directional signals for people. There's wonderful tiles that have been moderately well restored or repaired on 6th Avenue around 22nd Street. Look at this slide. Can you feel the impression? Can you imagine somebody pressing and making a shape that looks like these shapes? Because this is wet clay. This was by a really interesting company called Hartford Faience, and it's wet clay that's stamped as opposed to the dust pressed. And it's very nice. It's somewhat irregular. It's kind of fat tiles. They did a few beautiful stations in the subway. And this is a totally different look from pre-made surface that was decorated by a really important person named Henry Varnum Poor, who has a home in New City, New York. I don't know if we'll be able to save it. We've been working on it for a long time, but he decorated the bathroom, the toilet. He did everything. He made the light fixtures, the knobs for the furniture, and he was a very important painter, but also a very well-known ceramicist. And he did this mural, which anyone can see on Fifth Avenue. If you walk into the Mount Sinai Hospital, it's sitting right in the waiting room. And it's just beautiful. It's really, really interesting. It tells you a lot about the animals in Central Park and so on. He focused on site-specific. This is a detail from a subway project I worked on, also trying to be site-specific because it's Parkside. You're smiling. Oh, that's your station? Okay, well, would you take a rag and clean that stuff? And then combination. On the outside of the Elephant House, there's all this beautiful, beautiful terracotta. Hines and Lafarge were responsible for a lot of the early buildings at the zoo. And they were also responsible for the subway system. So there's this very nice overlap of ceramics in both places. Inside the Lion House were these Groobie tiles, which have been removed and numbered and hopefully will be put back carefully. So here's a building where you have tile and terracotta. You will find the terracotta outside much more frequently than inside. And I would say the reverse for a tile. Scale, big, big concern between tile and terracotta. And this head came from that mold, and it's big. It's big. And that's from Gladdy McBean in California, great company. Okay, when you're making terracotta, you start in quite a different way than you might with tile. Because if you're doing 6-inch square tiles or 4-inch square tiles, you know you have a certain surface, and then there's going to be cuts at the edge when you install, and you work that way. This is quite different. To begin with, you have to have an estimate, and this near screen shows an estimating record that came from one of the terracotta companies. Your estimator had to be on target, because if you don't have the right estimate and you get the job, you lose money. So you have to know the costs, and this is one of the important skills. Once the job has been assigned to a company, the next thing is to begin to do drawings from the architect's drawings to shift the design so that it can be made in clay. Now, you are just going to go back a second. Look at the faces. You can see a face at the very top with petals surrounding it. This was a drawing that was given to Rookwood Pottery, and this is how they translated it. Now, these drawings had to be approved by the architect, or these photographs, so that then the molds could be made and ultimately the ceiling created. What's very nice to realize is that these 6 flowers are slightly different in design. Each one has a back that looks like a screw. It's a stem that's threaded. So the installer would put a little bit of mortar on and twist it in place. And you can see the individual ones in place. So it's a handmade ceiling. It's just incredible, and it is landmarked. And if you don't mind a loud steak, Wolfgang's is a great place to go and at least look at it. This is a historic image of what the room looked like. And it was the little room. This was in the Vanderbilt Hotel, 33rd and Park. And they had the Della Robbia room, which was the most extraordinary room the company ever made. Floors were marble and tile all over, and Guastavino's ceiling. And it was destroyed to turn it into a parking garage. So there's a parking garage with a nice marble floor in the former Vanderbilt Hotel. And so we were very anxious. That happened probably in the 50s or 60s, and the outside of the building was stripped, also the lower portions then. Since then, we've been trying to see that the upper areas are taken care of and that this was landmarked, so it's not going to be destroyed. Just want you to see that from the situation where you have the drawings, you enlarge the drawings because clay shrinks, and you're not going to get the right size if you don't realize you have to enlarge, and each clay shrinks differently, so you need to know that. And then the sculptors working in the modeling room create a three-dimensional version, which you saw of the ceiling. It's photographed, you saw the photograph, and then it's sent to the architect for an initial approval. And then it comes back, and then it's made. Now, we'll talk about how it's made in a second, but what I would like you to see is this is the difference between a piece that's partly finished and one that's just being started, the two sides. So you can see the kind of labor-intense work that's involved in creating this kind of ornament. Very cool. I was given pictures by a woman whose father was a modeler at the New York company. Oh, come on, go back. And this was one of the pictures. He modeled this, and I had enough information so that I could find some of these buildings. Most I couldn't, but one day I was up shooting pictures of Parkchester, which is an incredible facility up in the Bronx. Very, very large residential facility with great terracotta on it. And I turn around and I see this little building called the Web Tree, and it's got this basically the same design as this what Isadora Kaplan's photograph showed. What's different is if you look under her chin, in some cases you'll see rounded motif, in some cases a flower and leaves. So what's very nice is that you could have a mold and say, oh, I'm going to give this one leaves, and this one I'm going to give, spirals, and this one. And that happened in many places. So, for example, the subway system, where there are numbers that go in, those number plaques could be used, for each individual station, but the surrounds could be used for 20 stations or 30 stations. So the fact that the material had some flexibility in the way that you combine it was very useful in design. What you have here is a recreation of this Neptune's head from a tiny historic black and white drawing. That was it. So some had to be left to the modeler's imagination. This is the Audubon Ballroom, which we tried to landmark, but Columbia owned it, and they did a facadism thing on it, and it's not a successful preservation project in my mind. Part of it is still there. Okay, when you have the plaster mold, you then need to impress clay into it. And this is what the mold looks like. So it's got actually 4 sides and a base. This is the simplest of molds. There you go. That's a look. It's a very big mold, this one. Really big. Not as big as the lion, but big. Here's a mold where you're taking the pieces apart, removing the plaster, and then you'll be able to finish the designs. Here is someone who's doing fine finishing on the piece that's just come out of a mold. You take it out when it's pretty, not hard, but a little bit harder than when you put it in. Otherwise, it would sag. Then you have glazing. The rare women appear in the factory to do some genteel glazing with brushes. And this is a range of the glazes that you can see and get. And if you notice, there's a couple in there that look like granite or stone, and that's because they are intended to mimic the material. Here's a project I was working on in brick, and that's up at the Boston Valley Terracotta. We were using a different idea for brick. It's threaded, so you can turn the bricks. It's not mortared. And this gives you an idea of the ability to mimic. The upper portion of this slide, all the way down to the line here, is clay. From these last two blocks are limestone. Tricky stuff, okay? This is metal enamel, the black, in a building directly next to one with terracotta. So one of the cool parts of all this is to hone in your eye so that you begin to know what the material is, whatever it is. And that's exciting, and it's important because you can't repair properly without that knowledge. So then we have the kilns where pieces are fired, and the finished work is waiting to be shipped. You can see there's a railroad line, and they certainly have to be fitted and numbered, and the numbering is usually done with black paint so that it will match the setting drawings, and they'll be able to be installed appropriately, piece by piece. Yeah?
So going back to the ones where you have the little spot, the speckles to match the granite, that's called fritz.
No, it's not.
The little dots.
Yeah, it's a granular material. Frit is something else.
Is that done at the same time as the
Yeah.
general glazing is done?
Not always. It's a good question, and my 5 minutes is going to be taken up. I think it's very good. Granular, and I'll show you, granular material is like little hard pieces of sugar, but it won't melt. It stays, so you can mix it right into a glaze. In other cases, you add later, and there are people who have wrist problems from going like this. I mean, literally.
So it's most applied before they fire.
It could be, depending on how it looks, determines how it was applied. It could be either way. Okay, stuff gets shipped, yay! However it gets there, it gets there. And I'm going to run through this very fast because I just want you to have this information. There's several kinds of buildings in types. There's a masonry building. It's load-bearing. The walls and the floor are held up by the walls. The tallest that we know of now is the Monadnock. It's 16 stories high, and it's still there. And the base walls are 6 feet thick. That is not good for retail or for a lot of other things. So the idea was, how do you make a tall building that stands? And temporary solution was cage construction, where you had a cage that held up the walls and separate from the floors. So the weight was divided, and that allowed, in this case, with the Potter building, the bottom walls were only about 40 inches thick and maybe 20 or less up high. So that was an interim, but not a real full-scale solution. The real solution came with skyscraper development, and skeletal construction. And you can really see that because in this case, you could build from the top down when you have a total steel cage construction. You're not relying on the gravity and one wall holding up the next wall. So you see here Times Tower that is being built in when the material comes in, they can use it for whatever floor. They don't have to wait for the next floor. And in a nice comment by Sheldon Chaney from New World Architecture, who wrote a very good book, he said, "The steel frame transferred the weight to a few points of support. The problem was so radically solved that the clay walls could be built from the top story down if desired." And in a way, you're seeing some of that on the Times Tower. And you're seeing the speed with which something could be built. I mean, this was October 1st with a skeleton and basically finished November 19th. So that's pretty phenomenal, and this was in the 20s. Our great early clad skyscraper, our only Louis Sullivan in New York City. Fabulous building, very three-dimensional, and in reasonably good shape. Watch, fabulous, huge, 7-foot deep cornice with angels.
Where is it?
It's 65 Bleecker Street. It's just a poem. Okay, this is a much smaller building. It's, but it was hit in 9/11 because it's at 90 West Street, and had fireproofing that was clay, and basically withstood 6 fires in 6 places in the building. And it was restored and is now an overpriced co-op or condo. But the terracotta was quite stable because it was protecting whatever metal there was in the building, and it didn't face the kind of disaster the newer buildings faced. And of course, one of our greats is the Woolworth. It's filled with color. People don't realize it, and those people living in the $100 million apartment on top will have a chance to look out and see some of the yellow and blue and green, but there's wonderful ornament on the building. However, the gist of the building is really about the Gothic ornament and tonality. So the color helps enrich the design, but it's not standing out as, I'm red and green and blue. It's saying, I'm a Gothic skyscraper. So the color is somewhat secondary. Here's great color, indoor, rare example from the New Amsterdam Theater. I think it's the only part that needed no work. I mean, they dusted it. Mushrooms were growing in the building because it was a swamp. There was no ceiling. This kind of look-at-me color is very, very popular in terracotta for a period of years, in the Deco years. This is the French and Company. Yes, this was where one of the, I haven't brought this up to the Atlas group who spoke before, but Paul Newman lived in this building in Staten Island for a little while, so we might have to make it Weird Staten Island or something. It's a great deco building. It's not being taken care of well, but they're not putting money into it, which is good because they're not wrecking it. Sometimes preservation is best preserved through poverty. And we have the great Metro Theater, which has not been reused, adaptively reused for years. It's sitting there empty. The owner wants way too much money. Great deco look where the color is more important. It comes through. And our last slide, the Della Robbia reinterpretation with plump legs and high heels, and this is from Parkchester, which I mentioned earlier to you. So this gives you an idea of the subject of the areas of architectural ceramics. If anyone wants to look at any of the samples together or ask questions, sure.
Can I go back to the beginning, clay? You can't just go dig anywhere. Where does one find this particular kind of clay?
Okay, it's not a particular kind of clay. What it is just like if you're baking bread, it would be like flour. So I want egg in my flour to make egg matzo. Or egg, not making matzo, that would be fair. But I'm making challah. Okay, so you would need X number of ingredients. It's a recipe for clay, or a clay body, just like there's a recipe for baking. So you would get clay that's very white, maybe if you wanted a buff color from one area, and you would get frit, which would allow and help to flux the glaze or the glass from another area. You would get all these ingredients, and they have to be weighed out and measured, and then co-milled with water. And usually you try and age something a little. In Japan, it's 100 years. You age the clay for the next generation. You age it a little. Yeah.
Yeah, aside from some of the standalone art installations that you showed using terracotta, are there any other examples in New York City where architects are using terracotta not just for restoration or replacement, but are there new designs that are happening? Are there where?
Tons. Okay. Not just New York.
Okay.
Majorly in London, glazed new fabulous terracotta buildings. But unfortunately, one example I can point to is the Steinway Tower, which is going up on 57th Street. That's next to the other giant super talls.
Yeah.
That's going to have an entire section of panelized terracotta coming from a German company.
Okay.
I'm personally, it's very scary because the building sways and I can't imagine, but they swear shop has engineered it so it will not crack and time will tell. There's a very nice building on Broadway, just above, before Bleecker, that's just being finished now. Is the new Nike store on Broadway and Spring, which has Italian tile on it. It's quite interesting. It turns the corner. The material actually goes like this. So that's nice, and there are many others. It's finally being used for new design. And that's something that we've worked on for 30 some odd years, because if you don't, then it dies, the industry dies. And we're trying very hard to keep people interested, and particularly architects. This has been our biggest problem, is to get architects to touch clay. They don't want to get dirty. Let me take.
One sad thing is, you know, the Queen's Museum that gutted the entire building, there is terracotta left in the ladies' room and men's room.
Yeah.
Beautiful blue, yellow,
Yeah.
and red tiles.
Well,
You have to go to the bathroom, that's all.
Yes, well, Harrods
Everything else is.
has a great bathroom. I mean, there are a lot of really good bathrooms. I had to get help from Paul to go in, photograph that men's room.
I think it's the same.
Totally, yeah.
You find that in the past at least, that the great terracotta companies were located near the clay deposits, and is that why Boston Valley is where they are?
No, but the answer is yes to the first part. So in other words, we had companies in the East Coast, the Midwest, and the West Coast, and they all related themselves to specific clay deposits that they could get. And the other part was, who are your clients? So we see a great deal of Midwest activity with Midwest companies. And it makes perfect sense, East Coast companies, because what you see when you see estimating records like this is that the cost of shipping can make or break the bid. It's amazing because they often listed why they didn't get the job, like went to stone, project dead, local guy got it. That, so we can learn a lot about the companies through those kinds of things.
So is there clay, so Gladden McBean and Boston Valley are the big players now.
Yes.
Where did they get their?
They would, in some cases, they may be getting some ingredients from the same place, but Boston Valley has very good clay deposits on site, and they can dig some of their clay and then add the other things that they need. So, and that was true with some of the companies, but it really varied. The deposits varied, and what you wanted in a clay body varied because it had to perform a certain way for the job.
Yeah, do individuals or institutions collect tiles from buildings that have been demolished, or?
Did you hear the question? Okay, so that's a really very, very good point. But Brooklyn Museum has had a sculpture garden, and then it closed it, and now it's maybe going to reopen it. But They had been taking fragments for a long time and realized that they'd been storing them since the 60s and that it was very expensive and didn't make sense. In fact, they just went back to storage within the last couple of years and discovered that they own a portion of what was the Madison Square Presbyterian Church. It was saved. We knew that they got part of it from pictures, and no one knew where it was. The Met got a 80-foot pediment that was unbelievable. They decided that they didn't know where it was. We eventually did enough research to find out that it had been installed on a building, a library at the Met, and then the library was coming down, and they contacted the family that had donated the pediment and said, what would you like us to do? And you want to pay? And the people didn't want to, so they destroyed it. And they never owned up to it, but we have the records from their own archives that it was destroyed. So, it's hard to say, and right now, there are 3 or 4 small tile collections, a couple of hundred tiles, where we and many other people say, well, where could we give them? And there's really not the right place. There's something called Tile Heritage Foundation now on the board in California, and they do very good things, but they are not set up to be a long-lasting tile collection in a public realm. So we're working on it. Good idea, though. Yeah.
Yeah, with the landmarks preservation laws in effect, and then now local law 11, which requires buildings to, and my building's involved with that right now.
Yeah.
Does that generate enough business for some of these firms to replicate, replace terracotta, or are there substitutes now happening with fabrication with other materials?
Right.
Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. There's enough restoration going on to could keep the companies very busy, and in fact, they're incredibly busy. In a way, it's too busy because the waiting time is long, and then it would be nice to have more competition. But what was the second part that you asked?
Are there substitutes that are being
yeah.
used?
Yes, there are. For a long time, when the Woolworth was being restored in the 70s, no one felt that the one company then, Guiding Beam, was big enough to be able to make terracotta for the Woolworth. And they went to all kinds of substitute materials, including aluminum for towers and concrete for the terracotta replacement. So cast stone, which is a form of concrete, and fiberglass, reinforced fiberglass, are replacements. They're not recommended. In some cases, they're more appropriate than less appropriate. For example, when you have another material, to set it into a wall that has a separate material like terracotta and concrete, they react differently, and the movement and all kinds of things are different. It's not a good idea to incorporate into a wall 2 different materials. If you're forced financially, primarily, into making a compromise, the cornice in general is an independent element in the building that could be replicated in another material and could always be changed or could move independently a little bit. So there are a lot of questions involved. Ideally, if there's enough will, there's a way to replace in kind using terracotta. And
You guys are welcome to keep talking.
Right,
if you want.
no
There's
lunch.
another panel in here until 1, but it is officially
Yeah,
lunch.
right.
And now,
it was really fun to talk
Thank
to
you
you.
for
All these years, really understood. Closer.
So this is really smooth, and if you look at this, you can feel it was made by hand. Yeah. Feel it. Oh, fantastic. Thank you.
keep up. They're looking at stuff anyway. Alright, so what's this?
Are you still? Yes.
Finding out from the consultants.
Amazing bricks, it's falling right out of the wall.
Of course you did.
I'm not looking, you don't
Oh, you do that.
LPC's okay with it?
They're not okay initially, but
Well, they feel
No, I know, I understand.
She's got a place where it's all
it's like, it's
one
crazy.
We respect the joints, so you have real joints. And you're all of it. So we're,
But if you're purist, I'll always know it's not.
the difference is.
Sure, on Flatbush, it's a deco.
On a big building.
Yeah.
You
Yes,
end up either
well,
with
we
stripping
used
it
to
off
travel
and
Flatbush
nothing.
because we went out to Foundation Broadway, so you take Flatbush all the way out to the
If
bridge. So
we
you
had
see the
earthquakes
whole
here,
of
half of
Flatbush,
our
and it's
building
great
house
in
would
the
be
theater.
underground.
King's
Because when you take these off the steel that was there, you might have originally had creates
Yeah, it's great.
flange. And it's now, and basically, you go up on, you're up on a scaffold, you can take a 500-pound piece of stuff and block it. It's frightening.
This building's from 1920.
Well, that's,
Just spend, I took.
so everybody says, you need Robert A.M. Spurgeon.
We only got one block in 4 hours. They're taking
I'm dealing with
pictures
it.
of the the thing is, I have to have
Seminary,
time, and what I should do is, let me give you a card, it'll just say, and
We're trying to
then we'll figure
limit
something out.
overdevelopment and promote affordable housing. One of the issues is
There's very good stuff. My mother used to drive all the time going and work, and she would say,
very luxurious
"Oh,
building.
Shannon, you're at the red light, she's right down the creek." No, could be, I
But
think.
it is an economic issue. And,
Well, we're just facing it now. We don't
the
know.
contractor,
We have stuff. Yeah, I'm not in charge of that. We have already sent out to
And you
get things
can't,
back
you can't actually destroy it. You
for the preliminary
can hammer
work,
it and recycle it.
the creation
Draw
and
pieces and stuff, but it doesn't, we have
390
all these
Riverside
records
Drive.
of writing and
Redwood Street.
111.
so I'm telling you.
And I'm gonna be around the corner on Monday.
And you could start the tour
From
with
West
work.
Point.
Well, we can think of something, because there's also Parkside, I did Prospect Park and Parkside, and Parkside.
Well, I don't know. I mean, we may be.
Parkside one.
I don't know. When the construction, I guess they would have been contract that out again.
Yeah.
Sometimes they don't know. Sometimes they don't know what.
And
There was a building that was
That's
created
across the
Riverside
street.
Drive, Henrik Hudson, that has the most elaborate terracotta facade. They just completed it. It took over 2 years. They were not expecting that. And unbelievable, just scaffolding this stuff for over 2
I don't
years.
know what's happening.
And, I don't know what we're gonna face. It's not
The owner was in
that.
touch and then
It's a
he
50-story building.
didn't follow
I
up.
mean, he's one of those guys that.
But we're finding out that it's going to be fairly expensive, because I think the last 5 years.
It's something worth
Yeah, yeah.
Well,
Because
it's not
it'll be
big time development.
an order of
You have a
magnitude
chance of persuading
cost
them.
difference.
Yeah, no, I understand, and I think, and I'm on the board, and we're gonna have those discussions coming up.
Which contract?
Well, we have to hope that,
We have a contractor, W.E. Melvin.
to get it done right.
They're putting together the bids, they're putting together the bids, we don't have the contract yet. The architect is putting together the scope of the project, right.
Yeah, that would be good
This
to know,
fence, this
yeah.
If I can be of any help,
They have your card, thank you.
Well, thank you, it's great to
Oh,
hear
sure.
your talk.
Let me give you a flyer so you know about Friends of Terracotta, which I didn't even mention, because I get so involved that
Yeah.
Thank you, that was great, no, really,
Good.
terrific, thank you.
Great. What building are you dealing with at Morningside Heights? That's yours? Is it local 11?
It's 390 Riverside Drive, 111th Street. We're
Yeah, I
just
can't
going through
picture
the
the
process
building.
now
Okay.
of contracting and all of that, but we
Right.
require, we have a deadline and, you
I
know.
know. My studio is at 243 Riverside,
Oh, okay.
and it's being worked on now, and they just had a meeting, and they said, you know what, we're $1 million short for the money we need, so we need.
Oh, here, I got that.
Yeah, we need to assess everybody.
Yeah, well,
I
of
said,
course.
yeah, because you won't do a flip tax, you morons.
Well, we do a flip tax.
Of course, you have to.
We're not morons, but the point is, that we still had to take out a big loan.
Okay, no, that's one thing, we took out a loan, this is
Oh.
$1 million more, and they can't take any more loans, so it's.
Oh, you mean they
straight up
underestimate,
assessed.
they
Oh, yeah.
underestimated our
Yeah,
costs?
it's a
Oh.
huge assessment.
No, we
Yeah,
think we're okay.
yeah, well,
But
this
I think
building is
we got a
wacky.
million- It's about $1 million probably for us.
Oh, no, there's $1 million more.
It might be, I don't know, I mean, right now we
Right.
think it's.
A million here, a million
Right,
there, so
well,
you're talking about real money.
Right, well, you know, it's like root canal. You gotta get in
It
there.
wasn't as bad as that.
I'm
This
so
is
sure.
I'm working on a project about the old hotel.
Oh,
I looked at that building.
Oh, yeah, it is, it's crazy.
Maybe when they first did the first restoration.
that's when they pulled out.
You know how that all started, by the way? The
How what?
Upper Hotel restoration, the original restoration. They had rosettes under the cornice, and it fell into the middle of Herald Square, and it disintegrated. Nobody knew. They didn't know what happened. Some had an explosion. So sometime, not too long after that, another one fell, and then they said, "Oh, it came from down there." And that's when they put up the scaffold on it, and that scaffold was up years and years and years, and all the restoration companies bid on it, and they finally redid it, and they put a fiberglass cornice, which I don't really like the way they did it. And now that I'm working on this building, because they're doing some of the courtyards, and so we're going to be replacing some of the broken stones in the courtyard. And so I've been up close to them. I did some rework on the original cornice when they first made it, made by a company out in Pennsylvania. And the corners of the building are not square. So these pieces, huge pieces of fiberglass, they brought into my shop for us to remake the corners to the correct angle.
So they took them off the building?
No.
Or they were made-
So
they were gonna-
so I actually was up on the building, and I wish I had my book. Going up the scaffold, I photographed all of the window surrounds, many of which are still extant.
That's
And
great.
they're just phenomenal vegetables and fruits, and you could only see it from the hotel windows. And I was just on the scaffold the other day, and I took some pictures, but the next time, if I do go back there, I'm going to take pictures for you.
Would love to. That's great.
On Yeshiva University is a minaret.
Fabulous. There's more,
There's
are you
one,
thinking of the one with the triangles? Yeah.
this one.
They redid it. Well, tiles, I mean,
And
I
tiles,
think you can do.
what we did with that, and I had fun with it, we made a mold off of the original and included all of the,
Cut it, the lines.
patina and the
Yeah.
break.
Oh, nice.
So, and we colored it, with gel coat,
Right.
same colors, And I used it as part of my exhibit at the building trade show. People would come in and say, oh, that's really nice terracotta. And I said, yeah, the feel of it. Look closer.
Interesting.
Here, because that's what people always say, oh, I don't know if I get close to it. But-
Interesting. Wow, that's terrific.
But, you know, it's still, it was a challenge to make.
Yeah, well, the question will be how it holds up.
Can I be a copy?
No, I think we're good at things. I actually have to check in the other room because I left one back, because
I
that's
can
my.
be, I can be a shirt, I can push.
Oh, no, that's okay.
All right.
I'm gonna leave this here for the moment. I promise to come back. I'm gonna just check.
6 hours later, remember me? I used to be.
Nah.
50. Right. Exactly. Huh? Where you guys live?
Northwest, 97.
Oh. Oh, yeah. I'm working on a building on Monday, where I make things in five. And we're just do the initial drawings, everything for replacing terracotta on that. We're doing, starting a job on 115 West End Avenue, replacing that.
That's way up. Where is that?
That's like 104.
No. 9:15? I'm
Yeah,
240. And I'm at 97.
No, you're not.
243. 243.
That's Riverside.
West, oh, Riverside Drive. All right. Say it again.
Your apartment is on West End.
I'm glad someone knows where we live. Oh, so it's, yeah, you're right. It's a-
Boss, we trying to
Right,
set
I think we have a label on here somewhere.
Yeah, so we're doing,
Great. Wow. Okay, we have to take all the elevator.
this historic interiors?
Yes, it is.
You're doing Gould Library, right?
No, I'm not.
Uh-oh. All right. Can't do them all.
How's it going?
Oh, good. How are you?
Good. Just turning off the screen for.
Oh, sure.
So
I just
you have a new
put my
file
stick
here?
in. Yeah.
Okay. Great.
Do you happen to have a clip on that?
Yeah,
That'd be great.
absolutely. Do you want to grab a lapel? That's not it. Sorry.
Oh, and I just realized I took out this. I thought it was the stick
Another
from the
flash
last
drive,
one.
gotcha.
Yeah.
Let's get this back for you.
Testing, testing.
There you go.
Yep.
Testing 1, 2.
Okay.
This is a lapel microphone. You can wear your shirt.
Oh, great.
Do you want me to place it on it?
Yeah, that'd be great.
And do you want to activate it right now?
Not now.
Okay, so I'll show you how to turn on and off. It's off right now, so when you're ready, you can turn on, just pushing this button right here.
No, blink green let you know. it's on.
Okay. And actually, I could just put it in then.
Yeah,
So
just
I'll
a
just
simple
hold it
clip.
for now. Yeah.
Great.
Great.
That way too.
Thank you.
Anything else that you might need at all?
I was curious about the lights. Is it possible to dim them but not turn them off?
The only option that we have in this room, unfortunately, is just this hard switch here for most of the lights.
Oh,
But we
okay.
still
Actually,
have
that's
some.
fine because
Okay.
I can read. Yeah, that's
Okay.
good.
Great.
Thank you.
So just leave it like that for you?
Yeah, I
and,
think that's good.
All right.
Great.
Any other questions about anything at all?
No, that's it. Oh, and the remote's all set to go too.
Yes.
Right.
Yep.
Good.
Do
Thank
you
you.
have any video or audio?
No.
In your presentation?
Great.
Very good. If you do need anything at all, you can reach us at 2111.
Oh, great. Okay. That helps.
Have a
Thank
nice
you.
session.
No.
Here's a learner.
I'm here for you. Thank you. Very sorry. We love you.
Well, I'm ready to get this party started. So my name is Gregory Dietrich, and I'm a preservation consultant and also a board member of the Historic Districts Council. And today I wanted to focus on the historic interiors of New York City within the context of the regulations that govern them, the treatments for the conservation, as well as various preservation challenges over the years. Does anybody recognize this particular interior? Yeah, it's the Kennard Building. For years it housed the post office, and now I believe it's a special events space where people used to go to buy tickets for passenger steamship travel. So I was racking my brain in terms of the work that I do and how exactly, or to what extent, do historic interiors come into play? It turns out considerably. My work entails largely architectural history, so I'm largely tasked with documenting historic properties. And in this case, I worked with the Congregation of Our Lady of Peace in the Treville Farm Historic District to help them save the church from a closure, writing a report that argued about architectural and cultural significance. In addition, I've also been able to do grant applications, which also require documentation of interiors, of course, to get the grants, and historic tax credit applications, which also require documentation as well. And then finally, National Register nominations. This happens to be a Rosario Candela apartment building on the Upper East Side that I was able to get listed. So today's presentation is essentially divided into three parts. Regulation. I think it's safe to say that without the law, there certainly would not be the extent of preserved interiors as we know them today in New York City. Treatments, which speak to the actual federal guidelines that regulate the practice of conservation and design of historic interiors, as well as exteriors of historic properties. And then finally, preservation challenges, which are challenges that have arisen over the years, challenges to New York City's landmarks law, or challenges by community groups to owners or the city that are not necessarily being consistent with the protections of the landmarks law in terms of historic interiors. So I thought it would be instructive just to look first of all at how historic interiors are actually categorized by both the federal government and the local Landmarks Preservation Commission. So on the federal level, we have buildings, structures, and objects can all be listed individually on the National Register of Historic Places. In New York City, these can all be designated individually as individual landmarks. Pretty self-explanatory. Districts are districts no matter how you slice them, federal and local. And then sites are grouped into two categories in New York City, where we've got landmark sites, which can be a cemetery or an archaeological site, and then scenic landmarks, which by the city's landmarks law have to be publicly owned, and they are, generally speaking, publicly owned parks. But in addition to that, New York City has its own designation for interiors. So this may lead you to wonder, how does the federal government account for interiors? And they do through individual building listings, so that when a building is listed on the National Register of Historic Places, it includes both the exterior and the interior. In terms of the age threshold, 50 years on the federal level, 30 years on the local level here in New York City. And would anyone like to hazard a guess as to why it's only 30 years in New York City?
Real estate.
Yes.
Styles change so frequently.
Yeah.
That, you know, if we wait much longer, all those 1960s buildings will be demolished and we don't.
Okay. Yeah, I think it speaks to just the development tensions in the city, that when the landmarks law was passed and after the demise of Penn Station and the Brocade mansions, there was a real feeling that the city wanted to kind of get ahead of the wrecking ball in this regard, and so consequently they have a narrower age threshold. So what is exactly the criteria in New York City for designation of a historic interior? Well, first it has to be at least 30 years old, as we've established. Secondly, it has to have some type of a significance, whether it's social, economic, political, cultural, or architectural, or any combination thereof. And third, and very importantly, it has to be publicly accessible. So that's very important to understand, and for any of you who are concerned that the Landmarks Commission was going to designate your living room, fear no more. Also, just to note that the interiors of religious properties are not eligible for interior designation under the Landmarks Law. This, of course, speaks to the separation of church and state, and how the city would actually be telling a religious organization how it conducts itself within its building. Now, of course, we all know that the Landmarks Commission has no problem designating exterior of religious buildings, but the interiors, it's a hands-off approach.
They actually do have a problem with religious properties.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. I do think that it's sort of notable that we do have as many historic interiors in our religious buildings as we do, which is a testament to, I think in some, often, many cases, good stewardship, by the congregations. So proposing changes to designated interiors raises a host of questions. And this sort of speaks to what I wanted to get at in terms of regulations, is that what if you are beholden to both the federal standards as well as the New York City Landmarks Preservation Commission's standards? And just to say that the federal guidelines are actually rather specific, talking about preserving significant architectural features, significant materials, significant features, when proposing an alteration to a historic interior. The idea that if you're going to have a new accretion within an interior, that you make a visual distinction between the new and the old, so not to blur the lines of history. Also, that whatever the accretion is should be compatible in terms of the massing, scale, size, and architectural features. And then lastly, is to be reversible. So that is, if you were to remove whatever you have added into the historic interior, you haven't compromised the historic fabric. And I think the Kennard building is rather interesting for those of you who experienced it as a post office, and you probably recognize when you walked into that space that all of that was reversible. They were all counters that could be easily carried out of the building and not have harmed that glorious interior. So how about New York City Landmarks Preservation Commission? What do they say? Nada. All right, so New York City, case-by-case basis. They really do not have specific guidelines about what they consider appropriate when making alterations to a historic interior. But essentially, they want to see whether or not each proposal meets a certain threshold that would then put it in front of the Landmarks Commission in terms of a public hearing. Otherwise, if you were proposing, say, restorative work on an interior, that's most likely something you could do at staff level. But for something that is going to be an alteration to a historic interior, you will most likely have to go through the certificate of appropriateness process. And that entails, of course, going before the Landmarks Commission and public testimony as well. So that brings us to a really interesting case study, which is Grand Central Terminal. So at the time of the rehabilitation in 1996, this was a project that was taking place in a designated New York City historic interior, as well as pursuing historic tax credits from the federal government, which kicked in the fact that they also would have to comply with the federal standards. Now, just want you to note that this is an original plan for the Grand Concourse. And what we can see is this is the west side that leads to Vanderbilt Avenue, staircase here. And here on the east side, we also see another pair of staircases. However, as built, that's right, they were never built, on the east side. So here we've got the western side of the concourse. And then on the eastern, it's hard to see, but these are basically sort of flat walls. And the reason being, of course, was actually practical. There is a topographical elevation change in terms of the Vanderbilt side, the west side, as you know, where Vanderbilt Avenue is higher than the concourse. So you would need those stairs to actually get out of the building. On the east side, as we know, those passageways each lead to Lexington Avenue, which is at grade with the concourse itself. So the owners of Grand Central at the time it was built were not so fixated on retail space or usable space that they could maximize revenue for the terminal. However, by 1996, the owners were very focused on this. And so that when they were proposing the big rehabilitation of Grand Central, one of the things that they wanted to do was to capture the space here up above, this mezzanine level for retail use. And today, of course, we know this as the Apple Store. So they went to the Landmarks Preservation Commission with this proposal. Not a problem. They were on board. They went to the State Historic Preservation Office, which is the first hoop that one goes through when completing the historic tax credit. No. The State Historic Preservation Office felt that this interior was significant partially because the staircase was not built, and that was just speaking to the actual as-built conditions that were original to the building, and they did not want to blur the lines of history. So I put it to you, if you were the architect who was taking control of this rehabilitation, what kind of arguments would you make for this second staircase?
It was in the plans.
Yes, okay, so original intent.
Black and white,
Right.
We just forgot to include it.
Yeah. What else?
But one never thinks of forgetting to include something as prominent. One sort of thinks about saving money or at the last minute or endless other options. So I would think it was an intentional omission.
So how would you argue in favor of it? Or would you not?
I wouldn't recommend.
Okay.
Let's stay with the feds.
Okay, that is a true preservationist, absolutely. Any others?
You would improve circulation.
Yes, and absolutely, they did make an argument about the need for egress and the fact that they were going to use this level for retail use. And frankly, just having a single means of getting to that space could be a public safety issue. Any others? Hint, it has something to, yes?
Would improve the interior appearance because you're removing the old Kodak spectacular.
Well, okay, that had been removed many years before, yes, yeah. All right, so here's just sort of a hint. What is the style of this building? Does anybody know?
Mosaic.
Yes, and
Very balanced.
what characterizes that style?
Very balanced.
Absolutely.
Yeah, symmetry.
Yeah, so order, symmetry, and balance. So that was also another thing that was put forth as an argument for the second staircase. And then finally, although not the purview of the State Historic Preservation Office or the National Park Service overseeing this application, was program, retail. We want to put retail up here, and we want to make it very easy for the public to get up there. So that brings us to how these federal guidelines played out. Now, the upper photo is the original staircase on the western side of the concourse, and the lower one is the new staircase that was introduced. So, because in the end they did prevail, they were able to. Can you see any differences between these two?
And the newer one doesn't have the embellishments as the original did.
Yes.
That was left intentional
Yes.
to show that it was put in later.
That's exactly right. So they're making the visual distinction between the old and the new. They're very subtle differences. You see how the balustrade here has got this kind of bulbous form, and here it's more sort of angled, geometrically configured. Also, you see the lack of detail here, and here you've got these sort of foliate bosses that terminate at the end. I think what's interesting about this is that we all go through the station every day, and typically these are not things people notice, but this really mattered to the State Historic Preservation Office and the National Park Service, again, for the reasons of not blurring the lines of authenticity here. So that brings us to the next section, which is about the treatments. There are 4 treatments as set forth by the federal government. It's the U.S. Department of the Interior, under that the National Park Service. So on the federal level, it is this department and agency that regulate historic preservation activities in the U.S. The first being preservation, second is restoration, third is rehabilitation, then the fourth is reconstruction. All right, so what is preservation? Preservation is largely about sustaining the existing form, that is, preserving what is there. And I think the Rose Main Reading Room preservation is a very good example of this treatment type. I think maybe everyone knows the story about in 2013, one of these rosettes came crashing down to the floor in the middle of the night, New York Public Library. As you can imagine, that is all systems go in the institution. Like, we cannot have this continue for certainly public safety reasons. So they then hired a team to do an investigation of this plaster ceiling to understand if there were other potential failures that were about to happen. And by the way, while you're up there, let's do a systematic treatment that is going to repair any damaged or compromised elements of the plaster finish. So that was undertaken after, I should say, an investigative analysis of the ceiling, as well as work on the chandeliers, in which they did repairs of the chandeliers. They also upgraded them to LED lighting, and they did sort of a light cleaning. So that's a very clean example of a preservation treatment, because they were working with existing historic fabric that was largely intact to make repairs and maintenance. I should also mention, because Robert Stillman Associates, the structural engineer, worked on this project, and they devised a backup cable system to attach to all of these rosettes, so that in the event there were any failures from the plaster itself, that this cable would prevent them from falling. Restoration, I like to think of as sort of peeling back the layers to get to an earlier time. So in this case, there's a term in preservation called period of significance, and that often drives how you're going to go for a particular treatment. In this case, we have what I would call accidental preservation. So this is Grace Church located in Brooklyn Heights. While they were doing a cleaning here of this ceiling, they knew that this was what they call a faux bois application that was introduced in the early 20th century. And while they were cleaning, they found this starry night sky that was underneath, original to the building. I mean, you cannot imagine how excited the congregation was at this find, this discovery. Also, there's a frieze was uncovered as well that has biblical passages. But this is a great example of a restoration, literally peeling back the layers to get to this starry night sky. I also like to just give a shout out to Leo Blackman, former HDC Pres, and Dan Allen of Cutsa George, Tuman and Alley, current HDC Pres. I should note that of these 4 treatments, they are not mutually exclusive. You can certainly have more than one treatment at play, and certainly the Plaza Hotel, I'm characterizing as a rehabilitation, but there is also restoration involved in this project. So this was, of course, a big project driven largely by the owners of the Plaza's desire to convert 2/3 of the rooms in this building into condo use, so hotel to condo, but also to introduce over 39,000 square feet of new retail use in the basement. Now, this is a building that has a lot going on with respect to historic interiors. There are 8 designated rooms in the Plaza Hotel, which is a lot. It's sort of comparable to the Park Avenue Armory in that regard. And here we see this wonderful restoration of the Oak Room. This is some of the new retail space. And then in the Palm Court, the leaded glass dome was actually brought back, that was restored, that had been blacked out during World War II. And so that was really an exciting part of the project. Rehabilitation in general, the definition of this is to inject a new use or provide a continuing use, modernization basically, while also preserving the character-defining features. So that's very important, that you're always anchored to the historic fabric and preserving that, while also accommodating new uses in the building. The last one I'm using as an example for reconstruction is the New Amsterdam Theater, which was originally built to house the Ziegfeld Follies. So this was a very sad story. This live theater was converted to a movie house in the 1940s. And so at that time, much of the architectural elements, balconies and all, were completely shorn. Plaster figurines and other terracotta items were just completely removed. The entire auditorium was painted a chocolate brown. So can you imagine in 1996, now this is after a lot of planning by the state to revitalize this block of 42nd Street, which, by the way, during the 1970s had an average of 7 murders a year on the block alone. They were intent on bringing this theater back to its former glory. So they took the executives of Walt Disney into this theater, who were a prospective lessee for this space. And there's a tree growing on the stage. There are icicles coming out of the roof. Thank you, mushrooms in the basement. And for some strange reason, Walt Disney said, we're going to do it. So they put a lot of money into this thing and essentially did what I would term a reconstruction, because so much was actually missing. The thing about the reconstruction, and again, tying back to the history and what do we know, reconstructions, by definition of the Park Service that has established these 4 treatments, entails historic documentation. So reconstruction that is guided by evidence. Well, this is fascinating because they actually had a diary that was written by one of the Ziegfeld chorus girls describing her experience of this theater on its opening night. Vivid descriptions of the color palette, materials, the patterns in the carpet. So this was like gold for the conservation team and the design team undertaking this project. But it didn't stop there. This particular lighting fixture was found in a box in one of the executive offices upstairs. One lighting fixture. They bring this out, they look at it, and then they start to piece together, wow. There was actually a whole back of the house lighting plan that had multiple fixtures. So they were able to replicate it, install the LED lighting, and you have to know there was exhaustive paint analysis done to arrive at what we see today. And I have to say, as an architectural historian, that this is, bar none, one of the most glorious Art Nouveau interiors, I believe, in the United States. Yes?
I know that when I'm going to use this as a point of reference to make my point, the European fine furniture craftsmen
Yes.
had, books that had all the information on how to produce a particular piece of furniture, let's say.
Yeah.
And, so that was documentation. So when there's a structure that is made, doesn't that all go with some type of archive together, Huh?
Yes. Right.
I know that there's blueprints and everything else, but how?
No, not always blueprints either. No. No, you find that often, maybe more often than not, when you're doing archival research, that there is a lot that is missing in terms of that kind of information. Yeah, unless it's been acquired by a university, it's not, necessarily preserved in a sensitive way. Yeah.
Thank you.
Sure.
You also have to mention there was a big tax incentive given to
That's right. That's right.
Otherwise, they wouldn't have put just money.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I'm glad you brought that up. Yes.
You pointed out the lighting here. You also, I think in the Rose reading room, pointed out that the the incandescents had been replaced by LEDs.
Yes.
That makes a considerable difference in how things look. Is there any oversight over what the source of light?
Do you know, with respect to that, there is, I believe, quite a bit of accommodation on all levels of government to basically modernize in that regard and adapt to modern lighting standards, so that you see with certainly the rehabilitation of Radio City Music Hall, when you experience that lobby today, it is much brighter than it would have been in the 1930s when it opened. And that's because that is not considered an issue, ultimately.
That was a big question for Grand Central, how light it should be or should not be.
Yeah, good point. And Grand Central is interesting because, of course, they were celebrating the electric light bulb at that point.
The spectrum of light is different, therefore everything it lights is different.
Yes, yes. Anyway, I'm just going to roll along here, get through this. So I did want to just briefly touch on what the methodology is for these types of investigations that lead to these treatments. These, I call them really sort of the three pillars of any sort of historic preservation analysis. So the first, of course, is research. And that is what we were just talking about with what can you find that speak to the original conditions of the building, whether it's Department of Buildings records like plans and drawings. It could even be marketing brochures, of course, historic photos. This is interior of Webster Hall, which, interestingly enough, the Library of Congress has an incredible cache of photos on Webster Hall and what was going on in there. And then, of course, historic images, just illustrations and such. And then, of course, if there is any sort of manufacturers that were advertising their products through showing their work at a particular place, of course, that's invaluable as well. Survey. So yes, you can do all the research in the world till the cows come home, but then when you actually visit the property, I know, it's not there anymore. So that's very important. You have to understand what are the existing conditions and exactly what is the condition of the individual architectural elements. And then lastly, analysis, where you're comparing the research that you've done as well as your existing conditions survey, and really understanding what is going to be my treatment approach with respect to this project now that I know what I know. So this culminates in a preservation planning study, goes by a variety of names. We've got historic structures reports, existing conditions assessments, conservation reports. Generally speaking, these are always entail a background history on the building, but also probably on the ownership as well, to understand how the building has been used over time. Give it a big picture also of how the building has been altered over time. Secondly, to have an inventory of each room and an understanding of what are the character-defining features and what is the current condition of those character-defining features, along with when were they introduced? Are they original? Were there later alterations, etc.? And then finally, the third part is just the series of recommendations. So what does the professional then recommend in terms of the treatment approaches? And these can be very voluminous studies that also include cost estimates. They'll also include a prioritized list. So for instance, if you've got water coming into your building, that's top of the list. You need to address that now, right? Because that is, of course, affecting everything inside in one way, or has a potential to, one way or another. So that brings us to the third prong of the presentation today, which is challenges. So the New York City Landmarks Law passed in 1965 did not include an interior designation. This was actually amended to the law along with scenic landmarks in 1973. In the late 1970s, a commissioner who was an interior designer named L. Michael Brown sponsored, through the American Society of Interior Designers, conducted a survey and found over 700 historic interiors in New York City that merited interior designation. Anyone like to guess how many we have designated today?
117.
Okay, so Tara, that's how many? That's how many I thought, but I thought I better check the commission website. It's up to 120 now. So, but you and I were on the same page with that one, yeah. 120. Yes. So here's the thing about this particular type of designation and why don't we have more. The Landmarks Commission really does want to work with the owners on this one in terms of ensuring that they're on board, even though it's not a requirement of the law that they get their consent. But they do want to have a friendly relationship with the stewards of these buildings that they're designating. I did want to just briefly touch on some casualties over the years. I think one of the biggest ones was in 1967 with the loss of the interior of the original Metropolitan Opera House. So this was a really sort of a big preservation cry about what can we do to preserve historic interiors like this. The next one came, interestingly, after the law was passed. In 1982, it's referred to as the Grand Theater Massacre, which was what we know as the Marriott Marquis, which replaced 5 theaters, the Helen Hayes, the Morosco, the Astor, the Gaiety, and the Bijou. So this then, of course, compelled people, preservationists, to advocate, and also the Landmarks Commission to respond by designating the individual houses of Broadway, both exteriors and interiors. And then, at least a success story somewhere along the line, Radio City Music Hall, which was also threatened, I believe, with a gut renovation in the 1970s, and was designated in 1978. And we all know the success now that that has been through that designation. So I just wanted to look at 4 case studies briefly. The Seagram Building, the Four Seasons restaurant. This is a really sort of an interesting designation in general for 2 reasons. One, that Phyllis Lambert, whose family commissioned this building, was advocating for designation of the Seagram Building 20 years after it was built. So she already had this appreciation and understanding of how important this building was. Of course, the law said 30, so she did have to wait. And then the other thing was that the seamlessness between the lobby and the exterior of the building, that compelled the Landmarks Commission, when they did designate this building in 1989, to designate the exterior, the lobby, and then the grill room and the Four Seasons restaurant. However, by that time, the ownership had changed. And the owners in 1989 did not want those restaurants designated. And they put up, they challenged the city on this. They challenged the significance of the interiors. And I have to wonder if part of this has to do with the fact now that we see very detailed designation reports that call out specific elements to a fairly well, because of course these designation reports are legal documents. And in fact, the city did prevail and they did get designated. So that, of course, flash forward now more recently to the early 2000s, where we had site-specific art like Rothko, Miro, and others that were auctioned off in the early 2000s. And then, of course, in 2014, with the removal of the Picasso tapestry that was commissioned for the Ballet Russe, that is now on permanent loan at New York Historical Society. So notable, just to understand that site-specific art is not protected when an interior is protected, unless it's part of the architecture. The Manufacturers Trust Company building, this of course is a pioneering design that brings this idea of transparency to banking, most notably with the safe that you can see on Fifth Avenue. Look in and see. Also interesting to note that this space was originally designed to be sort of convertible to different uses. It was not actually, it was not envisioned as having to be bank specific. They actually did entertain the idea that this could be also used for other retail purposes. In 2010, the bank vacated the property, and it was at that point that a developer came in the following year and proposed to do retail in the building. However, as part of the proposal, that entailed reconfiguring the escalators, which were formerly parallel to Fifth Avenue, which is right out here with the safe like down in that corner, to perpendicular, so that in fact the entrance to the escalators would be facing Fifth Avenue. So this was a major change to an iconic interior. Essentially what ended up happening was they were sued. The Emergency Committee to Preserve Preservation launched a lawsuit that argued that this interior should not have been designated with the condition that the developer could move this staircase, which is an important part of the story that I'm sorry I left out. The fact that when they designated the interior, they struck a backroom deal with the developer that said, we're going to allow for the escalators to be moved, and then we'll designate it. Like, no, it doesn't work that way. So ultimately, as part of also that reconfiguration, they were moved to these sculptures by Henry Bertoia that were also part of the original design. The sculptures, by court order, had to be put back, but unfortunately, the escalators remain in the changed position that they're into today. Then even more recently, we have the New York Life Insurance Building, entailing actually a rather interesting designation. The interiors that were designated for this building were the lobby and the 13th and 14th floors containing this clock tower with its original clock mechanism that, by the way, requires manual rewinding on a regular basis. This building was owned by the city for many years, and those uppermost floors were rented out as gallery space. So they did check the box about public accessibility when they did this designation. However, 2014, a developer came in and basically decided that they wanted to convert the former office units into housing, so condos. And through that, they would also create a penthouse in the uppermost story. So there was a big outcry, of course, because that was the removal of the mechanisms. They were then saying that they could put the mechanisms on a different floor as sort of a museum artifact, but not functioning, and electrify the clock with the mechanical somewhere else. But in the end, a coalition of clock advocates from across the country, Friends of the Clock Tower, was formed, and they sued the city and essentially got a ruling in their favor by the court that basically said, because this was designated as a publicly accessible interior, public access has to remain a part of it, and also that this mechanism, which was absolutely proven to be highly significant with respect to clockmaking, had to remain where it is. So that was quite a victory for the preservation community.
So what became of the floor?
What became of the
floor? Is the public space, or the floor is a condo?
It was turned into condos, but the clock tower remains. Yeah, and has I think it has limited public accessibility. Yes. So the last one is just not a designated property, but this is former Avery Fisher Hall, which at the time it was designed by Max Abramovitz, also featured a dynamic sculpture called Orpheus and Apollo that was essentially here, and highly site-specific. So Lincoln Center, in renovating the hall, or actually anticipating a new renovation that now is apparently off the table, has dismantled this sculpture and stored it away in a warehouse with absolutely no commitment to bring it back into the space, which I think is rather unfortunate. because it is an incredibly dynamic sculpture that really sort of speaks to music abstracted, in this very sort of modernist language. So it's rather unfortunate, and again, speaks to sort of this, I don't know, I think maybe a flaw in the law that there's no way to protect the site-specific art that was designed for these spaces.
Along with that piece is a very good David Smith sculpture, which is shown occasionally, usually just outside of the coat room or something, stuck in a corner. And I
yes.
don't think that there's much respect for the artwork, at least in this particular building.
In this building, yes. Whereas the Metropolitan Opera House seems to be a little bit more on board with understanding what they've got. Yeah. So that concludes. If anyone has any questions, comments?
When was that 700 figure made? 700 interiors?
It was the late 1970s that survey was conducted.
There are only 120?
Yes.
What's going on with all the rest of them, do you think?
I haven't been in there to survey them. I don't know.
When that survey was done, was it photographed or did it survey a list?
I haven't seen it.
Well, this
It just numbered as
Yeah, I would imagine they photographed the
It's
spaces.
an interior book that Kate worked on.
That's right.
That would have a lot of photographs of a lot of the important interiors, some of which are landmarks, some are not.
Right. Well, thank you all for coming.